Well, good morning, Inland Hills Church, and I'm so glad that you are with us today for the very first week of a new series that we're starting today called Spark. And I actually want to say a little bit about that before we jump into it, just so that you know something that I know that you may not know, which is that we oftentimes plan sermon series and graphics packages and videos like weeks or sometimes months in advance. And so I am fully aware right now that the word spark does not necessarily carry the intentionality that we had behind it, because much of the West Coast right now is struggling with fire. And so the reason that we chose this was more about the spark that's in a relationship, or the spark between two people. That's the thought that we had behind it. But I just wanted you to know that we're aware that that's not a great look today. And we probably would have shifted and changed the name even if we hadn't had so much around this series. This begins our fall focus, and we have a lot of leader packets and things that we were designing and getting out to people. And we still want to focus today then on what it looks like to have a spark between you and God, a spark in that relationship. Before we jump into that, I just want to make sure you know about something, because we're going to talk a lot today about knowing God. But if you've made that decision to follow after Jesus, or to enter into a knowledge of God, to have a relationship with him, and you've never been baptized before, we would really like to invite you to consider baptism. And so you can go to inlandhills.com/baptism. Our next one is coming up on October 4th. And we'd love for you to be a part of that. I grew up in East Texas, in a small East Texas town called Grand Saline. And I lived just outside of town. My parents had owned a bit of land that had been in our family for a really long time. And land in East Texas does not cost what land in Southern California costs, I learned upon thinking of moving here. And so we had several acres out there. And we had a lake behind my parents' house, a little pond covered a couple of acres, and sometimes we would go fishing in it. And I always really wanted to go swimming in it, especially like East Texas heat is just insane. And it's not just that the temperature is high, it's also that the humidity is really sweltering. And so the air hangs on to the heat even through the night. It never really feels like it fully cools off. So when I was a kid, I decided I would start going swimming in the lake. The problem being that my dad came to me after I did that and told me, like, hey, I really don't want you swimming in the lake. It's dangerous. There's water moccasins. There's no one out here to watch you. Please don't do that anymore unless you ask me, and there's an adult out there and everything. So I did it again, even after that, because, in the middle of that hot July and August heat, it just seemed like the thing to do. So I went and I jumped into the lake again. And my dad found out, and he was furious. So he came back to me and he said, Josh, I'm serious. Like, if you go into the lake again without asking us and without an adult present, you are in big, big trouble. And he didn't tell me what big trouble meant precisely. I just kind of had to use my imagination to figure that out for myself. But I knew that I was in big trouble if I did it again. And I knew that I did not want to be in big trouble. Well, a few weeks went by and it's just scorching again. And I'm outside. And I'm with my brother, Caleb. My brother, Caleb's 2.5 years younger than me. And so there we are, two kids trying to figure out, like, what do we do about this heat? And I decided, you know what? My dad said I couldn't go swimming in the lake, but he didn't say I couldn't just put my feet in. And if I talked to Caleb about it and we both do it, then I didn't just, do it by myself. I had somebody there with me. That's probably like a loophole. So I said, hey, Caleb, do you want to go get in the lake real fast? And my brother said, no, Dad said if you did that again, you'd be in big trouble. I said, yeah. But he said if I swam, I'd be in big trouble. He didn't say anything about just dipping my toes in. So do you want to come with me and kind of take it just to get our feet wet? Just maybe we'll just go out into the mud. Like, and we just started to inch out and creep out there. And, what started off as just the water up to my ankles felt really good. And I thought, getting it up to my calves isn't really swimming. And then getting it up to my knees isn't really swimming. And honestly, it's not even swimming if I get it up to my shoulders. So I'll just keep walking out. And I kept having my younger brother walk out. And that was going really well. And then I don't know what happened. It wasn't my fault. But at some point, I just noticed that we were swimming. And so we're swimming and we're actually having like a really great time with it. I mean, I'm enjoying myself. And we're kind of like splishing and splashing around. And what I didn't know was that inside the house, the exact same time that we were doing that, we were kind of off to the side where my mom couldn't see us. My mom saw a turtle swimming across, a snapping turtle swimming across the lake. And snapping turtles would eat up our fish. And so my dad had a little gun that he would use to go out and shoot snapping turtles so that we wouldn't lose our fish. And so my mom yelled at my dad, hey, there's a turtle out in the lake. You might want to go get it. So I'm swimming with my brother. I'm thinking about what a great time we're having. I've kind of forgotten about being in big trouble. And I look up and my dad is walking down the hill toward the lake with a gun in his hand. And I thought, oh no, we're in big trouble, right? So I tell my brother Caleb, like, hey, quick, go underwater, hold your breath. And we go underwater and we try to hold our breath for as long as we can, and for like 17, 18 seconds maybe. And then we come up and we exhale all this air out. My dad says, boys, what are you doing? I was like, Dad, I'm sorry. Don't shoot me. I'll never do it again. He called us back. He grounded us, but he didn't hurt us, because that was never his plan in the first place. And sometimes what we see with our eyes when we don't have the full context, we actually end up making mistakes about what's going on behind the scenes. Sometimes we're not able to truly understand what's happening just by what we see. Religion starts something like this: that long ago, thousands and thousands of years ago, human beings started to figure out at some point that they couldn't control everything. In fact, as cavemen headed out of their caves, they started to recognize that, sometimes the sun is in the sky for a certain period of time. And when the sun is in the sky for a certain period of time, and when the water falls from the sky for a certain duration and length, then our crops seem to do better. And we're able to have more vegetation and plants, and the harvest is better that year. And sometimes we go hunting, and it seems like we chase our prey for just a little while. It doesn't take long at all, and we end up coming across, and we end up finding them, and we are able to kill them and bring them back, and there's a giant celebration in the village, and everybody gets excited about that hunt. It's almost like the spirit of the hunt is with us, and that somehow we're able to track that animal down faster. And so fairly early on in human history, human beings started to recognize that there are powers beyond our control. And they started to wonder, like, if perhaps we can't control the rain, and we can't control this ball of fire in the sky, and we can't control what the animals do, but perhaps we could get in touch with these powers that are somehow above us and beyond us and controlling these things. And if we could garner the favor of these powers, perhaps then we would be able to have things work out in our favor. The crops would be plentiful. The hunts would go well. Our people would endure well. Perhaps if we could garner their favor. So they began to believe that maybe behind each one of these things that they could not control, there existed a being greater than them, some type of God. And if we could just get the God that controls the sun on our side, or if we could just get the God that controls the rains on our side, perhaps that God would see our plight and would help us with what we desire. But what do you do to get the gods on your side? Well, if you're an ancient people, you start to think, what are the things that are most valuable to us? And the whole reason that you started wanting to get the gods on your side, the whole reasons you wanted to garner favor, was because you believed that you needed to have more grain, more meat, more food. And so at some point they decided to offer back portions of what it was that they got from the sun and from the rain and from the animals, hoping to appease these gods, to gain favor with these gods. At some point they built an altar, and they would take some of their fruits and their vegetables, and they would place them on this altar as a way to say, hey, we're not sure how all this works, but whoever's in charge of all of this, can you please take the gift that we have for you? And can you recognize that we are grateful and thankful for when you increase the rain, and you increase the sun, and you increase the hunt, and when we have food to eat? We offer a portion back. But sometimes you would offer a portion, and next year the rains would come even more and the crop would be even better. And sometimes you would offer a portion, and next year it would dry up. You offered the same gift, but it didn't work out. The seasons didn't cooperate in the way that you hoped they would. And so you were still out of food, out of hope. So what do you do then? Well, at that point, you have to think, it must be that our first gift the gods appreciated, but our second gift the gods didn't appreciate. So we just need to offer more. And if we offer more, then perhaps the gods will smile on us and appreciate that gift. And if more fruits and vegetables don't work, perhaps more meats. Or if that doesn't work, perhaps something that's even more important to us. This is why so many early prehistoric religions that we found evidence of seem to have moved through the ideas of offerings and altars, and eventually they're sacrificing to the gods. Once they get to a point of desperation, the thing that they find most valuable, people, human beings. We read about those ancient cultures who offered humans as sacrifices, and we say, that's insane, that's barbaric, that doesn't make any sense. But if you truly believed that you had to have the gods on your side, and the gods were capricious, and the gods were open to whim, and the gods were constantly looking for you to do more and more and more. And if you don't get the gods on your side, not just are you going to perish, but your family will perish, and your village will perish, or your city will perish. Like, all of these things are going to go up in smoke. At some point, you decide that almost anything you could place on this altar would be totally justified. And as they work through this, the question is always, how much is enough? How much is enough for us to offer? And the answer to this question is always more. More. There's never enough. You always have to come back to the altar and give more. And the amount of blessing you received was how you could know the gods. If you received blessing, then you knew that the gods were on your side. And if you didn't receive blessing, you assumed that the gods were not on your side. But if you wanted to know the eternal, to know something that was greater than you, beyond you, something that had control over more than you, this was your option. And how they responded was how you could know the gods. Now, a few thousand years ago, in the Middle East, there began to be a new way of understanding religious beings, of gods, of the God, than had ever been understood before. In fact, a few thousand years ago, there was a religious group that came along, a people who said that there are not multiple gods, that there's just one God. And this one God actually wants you to know him and to have relationship with him. This one God is not capricious. He's not going to rain down fire. He's not going to wait for human sacrifice. In fact, this God absolutely refuses that and says that's a horrible pathway to go. But this God still worked within the system that these people understood. This God offered sacrifices as a way for people to come to him, because that was something that they understood. In fact, if you've ever read the book of Leviticus, right? It's toward the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus is the third book. In fact, lots of people who decide to read through the whole Bible in a year actually get to the book of Leviticus and that's where they crash. Like, going any further than that is just really, really difficult. Leviticus is hard because Leviticus consists of a whole lot of laws. And if you just read the laws without much context, it can kind of just seem like a B-level slasher film with no plot, which is just another way of saying B-level slasher film. None of them have any plots. But there's just a lot of blood and animals and sacrifice in the book, and it feels super confusing to a 21st century person to see what's happening in the book of Leviticus. There's different sacrifices that God asks the people of Israel, the Israelites, the Hebrew people, to make. And just a few examples of these. He says, like, they can make burnt offerings, they can make grain offerings, they can make peace offerings. This included a meal. They can make sin offerings, and they can make trespass offerings. In fact, for all of the ways that you might want to garner the favor of God or the gods, God says, I actually have a plan for that, a solution for that. And you can do these things, and then we can be on the same page with one another. In fact, there was even a way for the sin of the whole community to once a year be recognized. And in Leviticus 16, 7 through 8, we read this. He's talking about the high priest. It says, then he is to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he is to cast lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. So there's a sacrifice to be made, an offering to God. And again, this is a people who is very familiar with sacrifice. In fact, human beings have been incredibly familiar with sacrifice for many, many years by the time we get to this section. And yet, God is taking a concept that they know, a concept that they understand, and he's reshaping how they understand it. Aaron's going to make a sin offering to the Lord, a sacrifice to show that we take this seriously. But the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat, this is the goat that really represents Israel, the goat that really represents the sin of a nation, shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement And how is atonement made? By sacrificing him? No. Atonement's actually made by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. People, thousands of people, would gather around. And it was understood that the sins, the misdeeds, the wrong things that the nation had done. And look, we can probably think of some misdeeds in our own nation, right? In the United States, we are struggling right now in many ways. We've got a pandemic and an economic recession. We're struggling relationally. We've struggled with families right now. We're struggling with violence. We've seen over the last several months racial violence. We've also seen violence against police officers. In fact, just yesterday, 2 LA Sheriff's County deputies were assaulted, like blindsided, ambushed, and shot multiple times. Like we're reading daily things that are happening that we would say, that's wrong. That's not okay. So we have national sin that we would say, like, these things are unjust. They're not okay. We can't keep doing that anymore. We've got to pull that back. We also all have personal sin, personal failure, personal breaking of things. You could probably point to places where you haven't engaged in a relationship in the way that you should have, or in ways that you became selfish in ways that were hurtful to others. There's all kinds of things that we can think about when we start to think of sin. Israel was similar, right? You have this national sin and this individual sin, and what God offers them here in the book of Leviticus in multiple ways, but I find this one to be exceptionally fascinating, is like put the sin of the goat. Like basically the goat is taking the sin of the people, right? You're gonna take the sin of the people and you're gonna essentially say, like, this goat is a representative of that sin, and you're gonna set it loose into the wilderness. You're gonna send it away and say, look, the sin of the nation is gone. Like, we're sending it out. It's not a part of who we are anymore. And in passing all these laws and asking Israel to constantly do these things, in building these basically metaphorical pictures for them to see what's happening, this is what God is saying over and over again to this people in the Middle East, this Hebrew people. He's saying, you can have peace with God. We read through Leviticus and we decide that, like, you know what, this seems barbaric, it seems backward, it seems like wrong, it seems violent, it seems bloody, and it's true. In the 21st century, all of it does. But what we need to recognize is that back when this was happening, it was a giant leap forward in human consciousness. To actually say, like, you know what, you can come to the altar and I'm gonna tell you exactly what to do in order to recognize the sin and darkness in your life that keeps you from living into who I've called you to be. And I'm going to tell you exactly what to do in order to keep peace with me. That was a giant leap forward. This was one God, not multiple. This was a God who was not capricious. This God did not tear off on fancy flights of anger for no apparent reason. He didn't use human beings for his own gain. This was a God who seemed to desperately want to know and have right relationship with human beings and to show them how they could have peace with him. As you can imagine, this being very different, this got a lot of traction. In fact, tens of thousands of Israelites chose to follow after this God. And in fact, many other people who weren't born into the Hebrew clan, that's not a part of who they were by blood, they still became known as God-fearers, is what the Israelites called them. They were Gentiles who decided, they actually thought that this understanding of who God is and what this God asks is incredibly compelling. So by the time we get into the first century in Jesus' day and age, you have this temple and they're bringing sacrifices to it over and over and over again. This altar smoke is basically going up constantly. Why? Because the temple was how you could know God. Now, what's fascinating about this is that even then, they were a little uneasy with the way that this was being understood by some people. It doesn't seem, from what we can tell, to have ever been the case that God wanted to simply reduce a relationship with him down to a formula. Make these sacrifices, do this thing, and then you can be right with me. In fact, in the book of Psalms and in the prophets, repeatedly God talks about, or people who follow after God talk about the fact that it's not actually sacrifice that you want. That was you coming into a system that we already understood and reshaping it and reshaping our imaginations. But that's not the bottom line of what you wanted. In Psalm chapter 40, verses 6-8, David writes this: "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then I said, here I am, I have come. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart." In other words, look, it wasn't the sacrifices that you wanted. It's my obedience. It's my heart. It's my very being. That's what you were after the whole time. And the sacrifices were a way to get at that. In Amos chapter 5, we read this. This is God speaking. He says, I despise your religious festivals. Whoa, God, weren't you the one who told us to celebrate these religious festivals? Weren't you the one who told us exactly how we were supposed to walk forward with this? Weren't you the one who instructed exactly what it was that we were to bring to the altar? Isn't that what you told us? God says, no, actually, I hate those things. I despise them. Why? Your assemblies are a stench to me. Because even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. In other words, it's not just about like marking something off the box and then now you're done. I won't accept them. Why? Because though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Why? Because I want your heart. Like you can go through the motions of this and refuse to give me your heart. This was never the end goal. This was a means toward it. In Psalm 51, the psalmist writes, you do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. In other words, look, it was never about offerings primarily. It was always about the condition of the heart. And what we have to understand as we look through the Hebrew people's understanding of what it meant to have right relationship with God, to know God, is that these sacrifices were always about more than obligating God to us. It's not the case that if you just did what you were supposed to and you stuck with the script, then God would suddenly just like, oh, just pop to and do whatever you wanted him to do. No. These sacrifices were always about showing us the severity of our own sin. As you came and you placed your hands on the animal that you were offering as a sacrifice. As the priest slit that animal's throat and the blood began to pour out of that animal, you were reminded of the seriousness of what it looks like to break relationship with God and to break relationship with others. And hopefully that led you to pursue God, to long for God, to live life in a Godward direction. It was never the sacrifice he was after. It was the heart, it was the being, it was the person. So that by the time we get to the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament, God is promising he's going to do something totally new. In Jeremiah 31:31, God tells Jeremiah that he's going to start a new covenant with his people, and it's not going to be like the last one. In this old covenant, you had to bring sacrifices to the priest, and that was how you knew me. The priest would tell you to know the Lord, or the king would tell you to know the Lord, but people didn't individually really know me, and I'm going to change that, he says in Jeremiah. So in Jeremiah 31:34, he says this, no longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. This is what's coming. This is what's coming. And this is what Jesus ends up leading to. See, they thought it was through the temple that they could know the Lord. It was through these sacrifices that they could find peace with God. And it was to a certain extent. But Jesus comes and he turns that completely upside down. In fact, in Matthew, in John, and Mark, we have this story about Jesus walking into the temple, the very temple where you could know the Lord, the very temple where you could find peace with God, and putting an end, a stop, a pause to all of the temple work that happens that day. We read this in Matthew chapter 21. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. In fact, we find out in some of the other gospels that he actually fashions a whip and goes in and he's cracking the whip. Like people are scared, they leave. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, that my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Jesus walks into the temple, overturns the tables, changes the total script for just a few minutes. And for just a few minutes, he puts a complete pause to a system of sacrifices that has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years by this point. It's as if he's saying, like, this is no longer going to be the way that people know God. Jesus stops the temple flow. Jesus continues to live and point toward God. He does miracles in the name of God. He continues to equate himself with God through various ways as he's going about and teaching. And he's letting people know that if you really want to know God, all you have to do is look here. Jesus calls us to look at him. In John chapter 15, he says, like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So don't say, show me the Father, because Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. There's not more information to be gathered about the Father if you look elsewhere. Hebrews chapter 10, we read this. The law is only a shadow of the good thing, right? This law that the Israelites were following, the Levitical law, it's only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. And for this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. In other words, you can keep coming back to this altar, you can keep offering these sacrifices, but the law was never going to make it so that you could come one time, make a sacrifice, and that would cover you, and that would be the only thing that needed to happen. No, you had to keep coming back to it year after year to remember the seriousness of your sin. Otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. In other words, they didn't actually release us of all the guilt that we have. They were an annual reminder of sin. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. In other words, like, this whole system was set up so that we could have peace with God and so that we could understand the holiness of God and so we could understand the brokenness of our own lives. But it never accomplished what God says he wants to accomplish in Jeremiah chapter 31, which is that we would have the knowledge of God inside of our hearts, that we could have relationship with God inside of our hearts, that we could actually have the brokenness and sin of our life totally cleansed and washed away. And so the Apostle Paul, one of the very first Christians, tells us a little bit about what Jesus does and what that looks like through his life, through his death, and through his resurrection in the book of 2 Corinthians when he writes, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Keep in mind, right, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, people have tried to figure out how they can reconcile themselves to the gods. How can I garner the favor of the gods? And Paul says it's actually been the plan this whole time that Jesus, through his willingness to die and to raise from the dead, would be able to allow you to reconcile yourself to God. What's the ministry of reconciliation? That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors. In other words, like, it's not enough that we found this reconciliation ourselves. Like, we have to go tell other people about that. Now we're ambassadors of this thing. We get to go share this news. Humans have wanted for thousands of years to be reconciled to God, to understand that God actually accepts them for who they are and wants the best for them and is calling them to a life of change and transformation to more closely align themselves with him, that they can rid themselves of the darkness and the brokenness inside of their lives. Like, and Paul says, like, this is what Christ has done. Like, it's taken a long time to get here. We had to gradually understand where God was leading us, but we're here now, and we are therefore his ambassadors to keep taking that message and to push it out as though God were making his appeal through us. And we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. In other words, the opportunity to be reconciled is available to you now. So take advantage of it. You're invited into it. Accept the invitation. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Through Jesus, in other words, God is telling us over and over and over again, you can have peace with God. The thing that we've looked for so long, the thing that we partially found at the altar, we find that we could never actually just come and lay down a gift perfect enough, good enough to remind us of our sin, to heal us of our brokenness. And so Jesus chooses to lay himself here. He who was without sin, he who was perfect, came to die a death for us. A few years ago, I was watching a football game. Football season starting up. I was watching a football game between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Buffalo Bills. And it was a tough game. And they went into overtime. And I was really excited. There's no reason that year that the Steelers should have lost to the Bills, but they just, for whatever reason, the Bills just had their number that game. And as the game goes into overtime, Buffalo, I believe, got the ball first. They start marching down the field. And there's a receiver for the Buffalo Bills back then named Stevie Johnson. And Stevie Johnson, quarterback, threw him a perfect pass. He's wide open in the end zone. He catches it, and the game is over, and the Bills win the game. But instead, he fumbled the football away, and it popped out of his hands. And the Steelers ended up coming back to win in overtime. And so the question is for Stevie Johnson, why did that happen? And the obvious answer is that he bumbled it, right? He fumbled it. Like it was his problem. He just lost it in the moment, whatever. There could be a bunch of reasons, but that's kind of it. And yet that's not the answer that he ended up landing on. Why? Because for many of us, we're always trying to figure out how it's somebody else's fault, not ours, that we mess up. My kids do this all the time, right? My 4-year-old William, he literally was running through our house the other day, and I'm just standing here at the counter talking to my wife, and he runs, and I guess he didn't see me, and he just ran right into me and bumped his nose. And what did he say? He looked at me and said, "Dad, you hit me in the nose." No, I didn't. I was just standing here. You hit yourself in the nose, buddy. But he didn't want it to be his own fault. My son Jack, 2 days ago, he's swimming, and he gets out of the pool, and he's running around the side, and he ran like we've told him not to 1,000 times, and he slipped and he fell and he hurt his knee. Not too bad. He's fine. But he stood up, and at first he said, I'm okay. And I just checked on him, not bleeding, nothing like that. No, I'm okay. Then he thought about it for a second. He said, "Dad, they really need to clean this area here. It's just fell because it's just not clean, right?" And it was just as clean as any other area in the pool. It just had but he had to immediately think, why is this not my fault? We all do this. Stevie Johnson did this. He wrote this on Twitter, and you can tell how long ago I captured the screenshot by this design of Twitter. But this is what he said after the football game. "I praise you 24/7. And this is how you do me? You expect me to learn from this? How? I'll never forget this, ever. Thanks, though." Stevie Johnson seems to believe that it is somehow God's fault, that he should have caught this ball, but at the last second, somehow God didn't have favor on him. And then perhaps because he praises him 24/7, he should have had favor on him. Or perhaps you've experienced a loss, or you've gone through a difficult time, and there's been something about that that's made you go why me, God? Or why in this moment? And you're trying to rack your brain thinking of what was the thing I did? What was the sin I committed? What was the thing that he's unhappy about? Why is he sending this to me? Why is he choosing to torment me like this? I have a friend a few years ago who misled me to cover something up. And I still see that friend sometimes, and I love that friend, and I've forgiven that friend, and yet I still see the look from that friend whenever we get together. There's just a look in his eyes are we okay? Am I really forgiven? Do you really forgive me? There's a look, and I know that we've talked about it, that says, does God really forgive me? Many of us, our entire lives, have been told some version of that if we would just change, then God would love us. But the wonderful news of Jesus is that God loves us just as we are. That he then, out of that great love, gave his life for us and invites us into a transformational relationship with us. He wants us to know him. And yet we keep going back to the same old way of believing about God that we've held for thousands and thousands of years, which is that the gods are kind of angry and the gods are capricious. And if I don't do the right things, they're probably not going to get on my side. And so sometimes I wonder if Christians, do we just believe in the same old gods and goddesses, but we just call them by different names? Are we not able to recognize that Jesus has made it so that we don't have to wonder whether we can have peace with God, but God has made a way to have peace with us out of his great love for us? The startling thing about what Jesus did on the cross through his death and resurrection, the startling thing about Christianity is that Christianity offers a direct, personal love relationship with the Creator God. This is not offered in any other understanding of God. In fact, in the Middle East, there are numbers of religions that wanted to curry favor with God. There are numbers of religions that wanted to find enlightenment somehow through God or the gods, to get to another plane of existence. But Christianity offers a direct, personal love relationship with the Creator God. In other words, I don't want them to just come and bring their sacrifices. That's never fully what I was after. I'm going to make the sacrifice for them so that they never have to do that again, because what I long for them to do is to give me their heart. What I long for them to do is to know me, so that no longer do the priests and the rabbis and the kings have to say, know the Lord, for they will know me. and I will forgive them of their brokenness and their sin. Perhaps if you're missing that spark of a relationship with God, it's because somewhere along the way, that story, that blessed, amazing story of a God who created the whole universe and yet loves you individually enough to want you to know him and to want to know you, perhaps that story has just begun to fade for you a little bit. And that what you really need is the spark of that relationship that God calls you into in order to recognize that he has a love for you that will never, ever fade. My hope for you is that you will choose to know God. Jesus has made a way. He's given you an invitation. And once you've decided to follow after Christ, the journey's not over. It's just getting started. So perhaps you've been a follower of Jesus for a long time, but there are still endless depths to be plumbed in knowing who God is. And he has continued to make that possible through the death and resurrection of his son. May you know that God longs for you to know him. Lord, I thank you so much for our time together today. And God, I thank you for Jesus' death and resurrection. God, I thank you that at just the right time, Jesus was the culmination of all that you had been setting up and calling us into. And so I pray, God, that today, in the 21st century, thousands of years removed from when human beings first tried to gain favor with the gods, you would give us a peace and a comfort that you are for us and that you have made a way for us and that we can have peace with you. And Lord, I pray that all of us would consider taking our next step with you, whether that's to get to know you more through the reading of your scriptures, through the reading of the Gospels and what Jesus has done, through understanding how this temple came to be and why Jesus ends up replacing it. And perhaps it's baptism as our next step, or perhaps it's getting into a small group at our church in order to explore this relationship with others and find freedom from the things that are holding us back. God, whatever our next step is, over the course of these next several weeks, would you give us a lot of clarity around that, and would you give us the wisdom to take it? It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.